The wind came sideways, sharp enough to cut. Mason Caldwell pulled his collar high and urged his mare forward through white blindness. Late March in Montana Territory had a way of reminding a man who was in charge, and it wasn't him. The blizzard howled like something wounded and angry. Mason squinted through the swirling snow, tracking the wolf that had killed two of his sheep the night before. The tracks were fresh when he'd set out, but the storm was quickly erasing them. His small flock couldn't afford more losses. 6 sheep weren't much, but they were all he had left of a life with purpose. The wolf's paw prints veered north toward the ridge line. Mason followed rifle ready across his saddle. 3 years living alone in this wilderness had honed his senses to razor sharpness. He could track in near blindness, read the weather in his bones, and go days without speaking a word aloud. Solitude had become both his punishment and refuge. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing something unexpected, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Mason reined his horse to a stop, tilting his head to listen. There it came again, high, desperate, human. A child's cry. Mason frowned. No families lived within 10 miles of his cabin. No one should be out in this weather. The cry came again, weaker this time. He looked down at the wolf tracks, already half filled with fresh snow. The predator was heading straight toward the sound. Damn it all, Mason muttered, the first words he'd spoken in 3 days. He turned his mare toward the cry, away from the wolf tracks. The animal would have to wait. Some instincts ran deeper than vengeance or self-preservation. Through the curtain of white, a dark shape emerged, the outline of an overturned wagon, half buried in snow. The canvas cover had torn free on one side and flapped violently in the wind. As Mason drew closer, he saw a small figure crouched beside a still form lying in the snow. Please, the boy couldn't be more than 9 or 10, his face red with cold, tears frozen on his cheeks. Please don't leave us. Mason dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the drift. The boy had tried to cover the unconscious woman with what looked like an expensive fur-lined travel blanket. Despite the quality of their clothing, there was no mistaking the desperation in the child's eyes. The woman lay motionless, her face pale as death. Mason knelt beside her, removing his glove to check her pulse. Faint, but steady. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Her silver-streaked dark hair and fine features suggested she was in her late 50s or early 60s, though cold and shock made it hard to tell. She won't wake up, the boy sobbed, his small hands clutching at the woman's coat. Is she? Not if I can help it, son, Mason said, his voice rough from disuse. He glanced around. No horses in sight. They must have broken free or died in the cold. No supplies within reach. The wagon had slid off the trail and rolled, scattering its contents across a quarter-mile of wilderness, now buried under snow. The woman's ankle was twisted at an odd angle. Mason checked it gently. Sprained, not broken, but she wouldn't be walking anytime soon. What's your name, Ba? Mason asked as he carefully lifted the woman. Oliver, the child managed through chattering teeth. She's my grandmother. Please help her. I'm Mason. My cabin's about a mile from here. Hold tight to me, Oliver. Don't let go. Mason secured the woman across his saddle, then pulled the boy up behind her. He felt small arms lock around his waist, cold even through his coat. The cabin was still a mile away in this storm. It might as well have been 10. Mason turned his mare into the wind and pushed forward. The boy whispered prayers against his back. The woman's breathing was shallow but consistent. 2 more mouths to feed, Mason thought. 6 weeks of winter left. God help us all. But he didn't slow down. The cabin appeared through the snow like a promise barely kept. A small, sturdy structure with smoke still rising from the chimney. Mason had built it himself 3 years ago, a refuge from everything he'd lost. It wasn't much. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a bed, and the necessities for survival. But right now, it was the only chance these strangers had. Mason carried the woman inside, laying her gently on his bed. The boy hovered beside her like a small guardian, his eyes never leaving her face. Get back, son. Let me work. Mason built up the fire, filling the cabin with warmth. He filled a tin cup with water from the kettle, added willow bark from his stores for pain and fever, and knelt beside the woman. Ma'am, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open. Sharp, intelligent eyes that took in the cabin, Mason's face, and the boy beside her in one comprehensive glance. "Oliver," she whispered, reaching for her grandson's hand. "I'm here, grandmother." The boy gripped her hand tightly, relief washing over his face. She exhaled slowly, then tried to sit up. Mason stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your ankle's sprained, not broken, but you need rest." He offered the cup. "Drink this, it'll help with the pain." She studied him for a moment, then drank without question. Her gaze never left his face, assessing him with unsettling clarity. "I'm Eleanor Montgomery," she said, her voice stronger than Mason expected. "This is my grandson, Oliver. We're grateful for your kindness, Caldwell. Mason Caldwell." He stood suddenly, aware of how small his cabin must seem to people like them. Their clothing, even travel-worn, spoke of wealth. The woman's accent was cultured, Eastern. The boy's boots alone probably cost more than Mason earned in a month when he'd been a lawman. "How long must we impose upon you, Mr. Caldwell?" Eleanor asked, reading his discomfort with remarkable perception. "Till the thaw. Could be 6 weeks. No one travels this country in March storms." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something passed behind her eyes. Resignation, maybe, or calculation. "Then we're in your debt." "It's not debt," Mason said gruffly. "It's just what's right." He pulled his pot of venison stew from the shelf and set it on the stove to heat. Oliver watched him with enormous eyes, dark and solemn. The boy was trying hard to be brave, but Mason could see he was exhausted and frightened. "Hungry, son?" The boy nodded. Mason ladled out 3 bowls, smaller portions than usual, but no one commented. Oliver ate like he was starving, though his table manners revealed his upbringing. Eleanor ate sparingly, her gaze moving between Mason and the empty cradle in the corner of the room. She didn't ask about it. Mason was grateful. When the meal was done, he laid out the sleeping arrangements. Eleanor would take the bed. Oliver would get Mason's bedroll by the fire. Mason would make do with the chair. Eleanor started to protest. Mason raised a hand. "No arguments. You're injured and the boy needs proper rest." She nodded slowly, studying him with those perceptive eyes. "You're a man of principle, Mr. Caldwell." "Just a man," Mason replied, turning away to bank the fire. Night settled heavy. The wind rattled the shutters. Oliver murmured in his sleep, restless dreams playing across his young face. Mason sat in the chair staring into the fire, listening to the rhythm of their breathing, sounds his cabin hadn't known in 3 long years. Eleanor's eyes found Mason's across the darkness. "You've lost someone," she said quietly. "I can see it." Mason looked away into the fire. Most folks would have let the silence stand, respecting his privacy, but Eleanor Montgomery wasn't most folks. "My husband passed 7 years ago," she continued, her voice steady. "Some winters never thaw until they must." Mason said nothing, but something in his chest loosened just slightly. The acknowledgement of his grief, spoken aloud by a stranger who recognized it without explanation, was unexpected. He hadn't realized how heavy the silence had become until someone else named it. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, for the first time in years, Mason wasn't alone with his ghosts. Mason woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory he had been stretching for months. Eleanor moved carefully around the stove, favoring her good ankle, as if she'd always belonged there. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pinned, her clothes brushed clean. "Morning," she said. "I hope you don't mind. I found your stores. You should be resting." "I've rested enough, and idle hands don't suit me." She poured coffee into his chipped mug. "Oliver is still asleep." Mason glanced at the dog curled up in the bedroll near the fire. In sleep, the child's face lost its forced maturity. He looked young and vulnerable. "Does he always sleep so deeply?" Mason asked, accepting the coffee. "Only when he feels safe," Eleanor answered. Something in her tone made Mason look up sharply. Their eyes met over the rim of his cup, and understanding passed between them. Wherever they'd come from, whatever they were running from, it had taught the boy to sleep lightly. Oliver stirred, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. He looked around the cabin, momentarily confused, then relaxed when he saw his grandmother. "Why do you live alone?" he asked Mason suddenly. "Oliver," Eleanor said sharply. "Manners." It's all right. Mason poured himself more coffee, buying time with a long sip. The question was innocent enough. The answer wasn't. Just the way things turned out. Oliver frowned, unsatisfied. His gaze drifted to the cradle in the corner, then back to Mason. The boy had an uncanny perception that made Mason uncomfortable, like he could see right through the walls Mason had built around himself. "And where's your family?" Mason asked, turning the question around. Oliver looked to his grandmother. Eleanor gave a small nod. "My parents died when I was 5, Oliver said, his voice matter-of-fact in the way children have when reciting painful truths they've accepted. "Grandmother takes care of me now. We live at Thornwood." "Thornwood?" "Our ranch," Eleanor explained, "about 60 miles east of here." Mason nodded. The name was familiar, though he'd never been there. Thornwood was one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, rumored to cover 20,000 acres of prime grazing land. That explained their fine clothes and Eleanor's air of quiet authority. "We were going to County Town," Oliver continued, wrapping his blanket around his shoulders, "to see Mr. Whitaker." "Oliver," Eleanor said, a warning in her voice, "Mr. Caldwell doesn't need to know our business." "Sorry, grandmother." The boy ducked his head. Mason didn't press. Whatever had brought a wealthy ranch owner and her grandson out in a March blizzard was their affair, though he couldn't help wondering what was urgent enough to risk such dangerous travel. His gaze drifted to the cradle. 3 winters ago, Clara heavy with child, the storm trapping them miles from town. The midwife couldn't reach them. Mason had done everything he could, everything he knew, but it wasn't enough. His daughter had lived for 3 hours. Clara had followed her by dawn. He'd buried them under the pine tree behind the cabin. Some days he still heard Clara's voice in the wind. "Mr. Caldwell?" Mason blinked, Eleanor's gentle voice pulling him back from the memories. He stood abruptly, needing air, needing distance from the sympathy in her eyes. "I should check the sheep." Outside, the storm had broken. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that only comes after a blizzard. The cold was fierce but clean. Mason's breath clouded around him as he made his way to the small lean-to where his remaining sheep huddled together for warmth. All 6 were still alive, hungry but unharmed. Mason fed them, checked their water, and lingered longer than necessary. The truth was, he wasn't ready to go back inside. Having people in his space, in his life, was like wearing clothes that no longer fit. Uncomfortable, constraining, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. But when he finally returned to the cabin, the smell of baking bread greeted him. Eleanor had found his flour stores and was kneading dough on his table. Oliver sat cross-legged by the fire, carefully whittling a piece of wood with Mason's spare knife. "I hope you don't mind," Eleanor said, not looking up from her work. "I thought fresh bread would be welcome." Mason should have been annoyed at her presumption. Instead, he felt something else entirely. The cabin looked different, lived in, not just survived in. "My father taught me to carve," Oliver said, showing Mason the piece he was working on. "Is it okay that I'm using your knife?" The boy had already made progress on what appeared to be a small horse. His hands were steady, his cuts precise. Mason was impressed despite himself. "You've got a good eye," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Just be careful with the blade." Oliver beamed at the praise, and something twisted in Mason's chest. The boy was starved for male approval, that much was clear. Mason wondered what had happened to his parents. What story lay behind the simple "they died" explanation? Throughout the day, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Eleanor rested her ankle but insisted on cooking. Oliver helped Mason bring in firewood, asking endless questions about the cabin, the sheep, and Mason's life in the wilderness. Mason answered some, deflected others, and found himself talking more than he had in months. By evening, the cabin felt different, warmer somehow, and not just from the fire. Over supper, venison stew improved by Eleanor's touch with herbs, Mason found himself studying his unexpected guests. Eleanor Montgomery was not what he'd expected from a wealthy ranch owner. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked with her hands. Her commanding presence came not from entitlement, but from quiet competence, and she watched over Oliver with fierce protectiveness that went beyond grandmotherly affection. Oliver himself was a study in contrast. He had the manners and education of privilege, yet adapted to their rustic circumstances without complaint. He observed everything with those perceptive eyes, taking in details most children would miss. And occasionally, when he thought no one was looking, a shadow would cross his face, the look of a child who had seen too much. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Oliver approached the cradle in the corner. "Was this for your baby?" he asked, his voice hushed. The question hung in the air like smoke. Mason felt Eleanor's eyes on him, waiting. "Yes," Mason finally said. "My daughter." "Where is she now?" "Oliver," Eleanor said softly. "That's enough questions for tonight." "It's all right," Mason said, though it wasn't. Nothing about his daughter's death would ever be all right. But the boy deserved an answer. "She's buried out back, with her mother." Oliver absorbed this information with solemn understanding. "My papa died too. Mama said he's watching from heaven." Mason set down his cup. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Then he's proud of how brave you are." Eleanor's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "And he'd be grateful for men like you, Mr. Caldwell." Before Mason could respond, the wind picked up, a low moan that set his teeth on edge. He stepped outside to check the sky. Dark green at the edges, another storm, bigger than the first. "Inside," he called. "Now." By noon the next day, the blizzard was hammering the cabin like fists. Mason braced the door with timber, showing Oliver how to wedge the planks tight. "Like this?" the boy asked, pushing hard. "Just like that. Good work, son." Oliver beamed. Eleanor watched them from beside the stove, her expression unreadable. But when Mason caught her eye, she smiled, sad and knowing. The walls groaned, the shutters banged. Mason wedged the last timber into place and stepped back. If they survived this storm, he knew his isolation was over. He couldn't unsee their need or his own. The days found their pattern like stones settling in a creek bed, unexpected but inevitable. 3 weeks passed. The storms eased. Though winter still held the land in its grip, snow piled high against the cabin walls. The world beyond was white silence. Inside, routines formed. Mornings, Mason taught Oliver practical skills. How to mend harness leather with an awl and wax thread. How to split kindling with a hatchet. Short controlled strikes. How to read animal tracks in the snow, rabbit, deer, coyote. The boy absorbed everything with fierce concentration, his small hands mimicking Mason's movements. "Why do rabbits hop in circles?" Oliver asked one afternoon. "Confuses predators, makes them harder to catch." "Like we're doing with the wolf?" Mason looked up, surprised. He hadn't mentioned the wolf to Oliver. "I saw its tracks yesterday," the boy explained, "when we were checking the sheep. It's still out there, isn't it? Still hunting." Mason nodded slowly. "Nothing escapes your notice, does it?" Oliver shrugged, but his eyes were serious. "Grandmother says I see too much for my own good sometimes." Eleanor contributed in her own way, taking over the cooking, mending Mason's worn shirts without comment, and teaching Oliver from a battered copy of the McGuffey Reader Mason had kept from his teaching days. She moved through the cabin with increasing ease as her ankle healed, anticipating needs before they were spoken. In the evenings, they gathered by the fire. Sometimes Mason read aloud from one of his few books. Sometimes Eleanor told stories of her childhood in Boston before she married a Montana rancher and learned to love the wild country. Oliver sketched with charcoal on scraps of paper, surprisingly good drawings of the sheep, the cabin, and once a portrait of Mason that captured something in his eyes he hadn't known was visible. They never pressed Mason about his past, but occasionally he found himself offering pieces of it, like testing ice on a frozen pond. "I was a Union cavalry officer," he said one night, watching the flames. "After the war, I became a town marshal in a mining settlement north of here." "What made you leave?" Oliver asked, looking up from his drawing. "Oliver," Eleanor chided gently, "not everyone wants to share their stories." "It's all right," Mason said, surprising himself. "My wife Clara and I wanted a simpler life. We built this cabin, planned to raise sheep and children." He stopped, the words caught in his throat. Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Life seldom follows our plans." "No," Mason agreed softly, "it doesn't." Later that night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Eleanor sat with Mason by the dying fire. "He likes you," she said, nodding toward her grandson. "He doesn't warm to many people." "He's a good boy." Mason poked at the embers. "Smart, observant." "Too observant sometimes." Eleanor sighed. "It's been hard for him since his parents died. My son and daughter-in-law were killed in a stage robbery 4 years ago. Oliver saw it happen. Mason looked up sharply. Jesus! He didn't speak for almost a year afterward. Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Then one day he simply started talking again, as if he'd been saving his words until he had something important to say. That explains a lot, Mason said, thinking of the boy's old eyes and a young face. He needs stability, security. Eleanor stared into the fire. I'm doing my best, but you're doing fine, Mason said. He's a credit to you. Eleanor smiled, the firelight softening the lines of her face. Thank you, Mason. That means more than you know. It was the first time she'd used his given name. The small intimacy hung between them, unexpected but not unwelcome. Mason realized he'd begun thinking of her as Eleanor, not Mrs. Montgomery, days ago. May I ask you something? She said after a moment. Mason nodded, wary but willing. Why did you help us? You could have left us in the snow, saved your supplies. No one would have known. I would have known, Mason said simply. Eleanor studied him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. The war left many men broken, bitter. You've suffered loss, yet you still have kindness. That's rare, Mason Caldwell. Mason didn't know how to respond. He wasn't kind. He was surviving, same as everyone. Helping them had been instinct, not virtue. Get some rest, he said, standing. Storm's breaking. Tomorrow will be clear. Eleanor held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Good night, Mason. He watched her move carefully to the bed, aware of a strange reluctance to end their conversation. 3 weeks ago, he'd gone days without speaking aloud. Now he found himself seeking moments to talk with Eleanor, to hear her thoughts, to watch the animation in her face as she spoke of things that mattered to her. It was dangerous, this gradual awakening. Mason knew it, but seemed powerless to stop it. Like spring thaw, inevitable, unstoppable, and likely to sweep away everything in its path. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Mason was checking traps when he saw riders approaching. 3 men on horseback, moving with purpose toward his cabin. He recognized trouble when he saw it. Mason hurried back, arriving just as the men dismounted. Their leader, a well-dressed man in his 40s with a trimmed beard and cold eyes, stepped forward. I'm looking for Eleanor Montgomery and her grandson, he said without preamble. Have you seen them? Mason's hand instinctively moved closer to his rifle. Who's asking? Harrison Montgomery. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm Eleanor's brother-in-law. We've been searching for them since their wagon went missing 3 weeks ago. Something in the man's manner raised Mason's hackles. He'd interviewed enough liars as a lawman to recognize the signs, the too steady gaze, the practiced concern that didn't quite ring true. Haven't seen anyone, Mason said, his face revealing nothing. Been snowed in for weeks. Harrison's eyes narrowed, taking in the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, the multiple sets of footprints in the snow that hadn't yet been covered by fresh fall. Mind if we have a look inside? They might have sought shelter somewhere in the area. I mind, Mason said flatly. This is my home, not a public house. One of Harrison's men, a hard-faced individual with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. Listen, friend. Harrison raised a hand, stopping him. It's all right, Burke. I'm sure Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell is just protecting his privacy. We'll continue our search elsewhere. Harrison mounted his horse with practiced ease. If you do happen to see them, you can find me at Thornwood Ranch. There's a substantial reward for information. Mason nodded once, noncommittal. They're family, Harrison added, his voice softening with what might have passed for genuine concern to someone less observant than Mason. We just want to bring them home safely. I'll keep that in mind. Harrison tipped his hat and turned his horse. The 3 men rode away, but not before Burke gave Mason a long, calculating look that promised future trouble. Mason waited until they were out of sight before returning to the cabin. Inside, the main room appeared empty, but Mason knew better. He knelt and lifted the trap door hidden under the rug, the entrance to the root cellar he'd dug his first year, when hope for a future still drove his actions. Eleanor and Oliver huddled together in the darkness below. Eleanor's face was pale but composed. Oliver's eyes were wide with fear. They're gone, Mason said, helping them up. For now. Eleanor's hands were cold as ice. Thank you, she whispered. You heard? Mason asked. She nodded. Enough. Oliver clung to his grandmother, his small body trembling. Is Uncle Harrison going to take us back to Thornwood? He asked. No, Eleanor said firmly. He's not. Mason closed the trap door and faced them. I think it's time you told me what's really going on. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, decision settling over her features. Yes, I believe it is. She guided Oliver to sit by the fire, then faced Mason with dignity that reminded him she was, despite her current circumstances, a woman of considerable standing. Harrison is my late husband's younger brother, she began. When George died 7 years ago, he left Thornwood to me, with provisions that it would pass to our son, Oliver's father, upon my death. Mason nodded, following the lineage. My son and his wife were killed 4 years ago, as I told you. What I didn't mention was that their deaths were not a random stage robbery. The driver was found with a large sum of money hidden in his quarters afterward. Payment, we believe, for ensuring the stage took a particular route at a particular time. Mason's jaw tightened. Murder, then? Yes, Eleanor said quietly, though nothing could be proven. Since then, I've been Oliver's guardian and the sole manager of Thornwood. Upon my death, everything passes to him. And Harrison, Mason asked, already seeing where this led, has received a generous yearly stipend, as specified in my husband's will. But it's not enough for him. Never has been. He's always believed Thornwood should have been his. Oliver spoke up, his voice small but clear. Uncle Harrison has been trying to make grandmother sign papers. He says she's too old to run Thornwood properly. Eleanor's lips thinned. He's attempted to have me declared incompetent. When that failed, he's tried other means of persuasion. What brought you out in the storm? Mason asked. We were traveling to County Town to meet with our lawyer, Mr. Whitaker. I have documentation of Harrison's attempts to embezzle from Thornwood, as well as evidence suggesting his involvement in my son's death. Eleanor's eyes flashed with determination. I intended to file formal charges and remove him from Thornwood permanently. But the storm hit, Mason said, understanding dawning. And your driver? Disappeared with the horses at the first sign of trouble, Eleanor confirmed. I believe he was paid to abandon us. He left us to die, Oliver said, with a child's blunt honesty. Mason processed this information, his lawman's instincts fitting the pieces together. And now Harrison's searching for you. Not to help. No, Eleanor agreed, not to help. He'll be back, Mason said, looking out the window at the tracks the men had left in the snow. With more men next time. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. We've imposed on you far too long already, Mr. Caldwell. If you could loan us a horse, we'll continue to County Town tomorrow. Mason shook his head. Too dangerous. Harrison will have men watching the trails. We can't stay here, Eleanor insisted. We've already put you at risk. We'll leave together, Mason decided. When the time is right, I know these mountains better than Harrison or his men ever will. There are trails they won't know to watch. Why would you help us? Eleanor asked, echoing her question from the night before, but with new urgency. This isn't your fight. Mason looked at Oliver, small and determined beside his grandmother, then back to Eleanor, proud, fierce in her protection of the boy. Something long dormant stirred in his chest. Maybe it should be, he said quietly. In that moment, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows, Mason realized he had already made a choice he hadn't known he was making. Day by day, meal by meal, story by story, these two people had become something to him. Not quite family, he wasn't ready for that word, but something more than strangers, something that mattered. The wolf still circled his flock, but now, for the first time in 3 years, Mason had something more important than sheep to protect. That night, the temperature dropped, the kind of cold that made the cabin's logs crack and pop like gunshots. Mason stoked the fire higher than usual, knowing they needed the extra warmth. They would have to wait at least 2 days before attempting to leave. Time for Harrison and his men to move their search elsewhere. Time for Mason to prepare. Oliver had fallen asleep early, exhausted by the day's tensions. Eleanor sat at the table, her fingers working a piece of paper into small, precise folds. Mason watched her hands, elegant despite their strength, moving with practiced certainty. What are you making? He asked, his voice low to avoid waking Oliver. A swan. She held up the nearly complete origami figure. My husband brought back paper folding techniques from his travels to the Orient. I taught Oliver when he was younger. It calms the mind. Mason nodded, understanding the need for calm in the storm they faced. I haven't been entirely honest with you, Eleanor said after a moment, setting down the paper swan. Mason waited, giving her space to continue. I told you Harrison wanted control of Thornwood. What I didn't tell you is that there's more at stake than just the ranch. She reached into her coat pocket, which hung near the fire, and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, she extracted a folded document sealed with wax. George's final testament includes evidence of land fraud involving several territorial officials and the Northern Pacific Railroad. Harrison is merely a pawn in a much larger scheme. Mason's eyebrows rose. Railroad money? Eleanor nodded. Millions of dollars worth of land grants are being manipulated. George discovered it before he died. He believed it got him killed. And you've carried this knowledge for 7 years? I needed proof, she said simply. It took time to gather. My son was helping me. After he died, I had to be more careful. Mason studied her face in the firelight, the determination in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. This woman had been fighting a silent war for years, all while raising her grandson and managing one of the territory's largest ranches. Why tell me now, he asked. Because you deserve to know the full risk you're taking by helping us. Eleanor met his gaze directly. These aren't just land-hungry ranchers, Mason. These are powerful men who have killed to protect their interests. If you help us reach County Town, you'll be making enemies. Mason was silent for a long moment, considering. He'd made enemies before, as a Union officer, as a town marshal, even as a homesteader claiming land that others wanted. But these were different stakes. I've spent 3 years hiding from life, he finally said. Maybe it's time I remembered what it feels like to stand for something. Eleanor's expression softened. You never stopped standing for something. This cabin, this life you've built, it's a testament to endurance, to refusing to surrender completely to grief. Mason looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. Clara had been able to read him like that, seeing past his silences to the heart of things. He wasn't used to being seen anymore. Get some rest, he said gruffly. Tomorrow we plan. Eleanor gathered up her paper swan and stood. But instead of going to the bed, she moved to stand beside Mason's chair. Gently, she placed the origami figure on the table beside him. Thank you, she said quietly, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After she'd gone to bed, he sat staring at the delicate paper creation, marveling at how something so fragile could maintain its shape against all odds. Dawn broke clear and bitterly cold. Mason was up before first light, checking his supplies and planning their route. They would need food, weapons, warm clothing, and a clear strategy. The nearest trail to County Town would be watched. They would have to take the high pass, dangerous in winter, but their best chance of avoiding Harrison's men. Oliver was awake early too, watching Mason with solemn attention. Are we leaving today? He asked, his voice hushed to avoid waking his grandmother. Not yet, Mason replied, checking the sight on his rifle. Day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. The boy nodded, absorbing this. Will Uncle Harrison try to stop us? Mason considered the question, then decided the boy deserved honesty. Probably, eh? I'm not afraid, Oliver said, his chin lifting slightly. Grandmother says courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right anyway. Your grandmother is a wise woman. She says you're a good man. Oliver studied Mason with that unsettlingly direct gaze. She doesn't say that about many people. Mason felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Help me feed the sheep, he said, deflecting the moment. We need to make sure that I'll be all right while we're gone. Outside, the world was transformed. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the tracks left by Harrison's men. The morning sun cast long blue shadows across the pristine white, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe deeply. Mason showed Oliver how to break ice in the sheep's water trough, how to distribute hay efficiently. The boy took to the task with the same focused attention he gave to everything, watching first, then trying, adjusting his technique until he got it right. My father had horses, Oliver said, scattering hay for the eager sheep. He was teaching me to ride before he died. I wasn't very good at it. You'll learn again, Mason said. Thornwood must have fine horses. The best in the territory, Oliver agreed, a hint of pride in his voice. Grandmother lets me help with the foals each spring. His expression clouded. Or she did, until Uncle Harrison said I was too young. Mason noted the shadow that crossed the boy's face. Your uncle seems to have opinions on many things that aren't his concern. He wants Thornwood, Oliver said with simple clarity. He's always wanted it. Father said Uncle Harrison gambles too much and needs the money. Mason filed this information away. Gambling debts could explain Harrison's desperation, though Eleanor had suggested larger forces at work. As they finished with the sheep, Mason noticed Oliver shivering despite his heavy coat. Let's get back inside. Your grandmother will have breakfast ready. They returned to find Eleanor at the stove, the smell of flapjacks filling the cabin. She had an uncanny ability to stretch Mason's simple provisions into meals that tasted like more than the sum of their parts. This morning she'd added dried berries to the batter, giving the flapjacks a sweetness Mason hadn't tasted in years. We need to inventory our supplies, Mason said as they ate. The high pass will take 3 days to cross in good weather. We should prepare for 5 in case of storms. Eleanor nodded. I can sew some pemmican bags today. We'll need the concentrated food. Pemmican? Oliver asked around a mouthful of flapjack. Dried meat, fat, and berries, Eleanor explained. Traditional trail food. My husband's mother was 1/4 Blackfoot. She taught me many survival skills. Mason raised an eyebrow, surprised. Eleanor smiled at his reaction. Montana changes those who embrace it, Mr. Caldwell. I've been a rancher's wife for more years than I was ever a Boston debutante. After breakfast, they began preparations in earnest. Mason brought down his larger pack from the rafters, checked his snowshoes for weak spots, and started sharpening his knives. Eleanor inventoried their food supplies, setting aside what would travel well. Oliver was given the task of sorting wool socks and mittens, making sure each had a matching pair. As Mason worked, he found himself watching Eleanor. She moved with purpose, her limp barely noticeable now. There was a quiet competence to everything she did, the way she measured coffee, the precise stitches she used to mend a torn pack strap, the thoughtful way she planned their provisions. In another life, Mason might have... He stopped that thought before it could fully form. There was no room for such notions. They were allies in a dangerous situation. Nothing more. Mid-morning, Mason stepped outside to check the weather signs. The sky remained clear, but the wind had shifted. He studied the mountain ridges to the east, noting a thin line of clouds forming. Maybe nothing. Maybe a warning. In Montana, the weather could turn deadly in hours. When he returned, he found Oliver at the table, focused intently on carving the small wooden horse he'd been working on. The boy had genuine talent, capturing the flowing lines of the animal's form with remarkable accuracy. That's fine work, Mason said, hanging his coat by the door. Oliver looked up, pleased at the praise. It's for you, he said, to say thank you for helping us. The simple gift caught Mason off guard. That's not necessary, he began. Grandmother says gratitude should always be expressed, Oliver replied earnestly, even when the other person says it isn't necessary. From the corner where she was sorting supplies, Eleanor smiled but didn't intervene. Mason cleared his throat. Well then, thank you. It's excellent craftsmanship. Oliver beamed and returned to his carving with renewed vigor. By afternoon, the preparations were well underway. Mason had plotted their route, using his knowledge of the terrain to identify sheltered spots where they could rest if needed. Eleanor had prepared enough food for the journey, including the pemmican she'd promised. Even Oliver had contributed, carefully packing small essentials into a pouch he could carry himself. As dusk approached, Mason noticed the clouds he'd spotted earlier had grown thicker. He stepped outside again, reading the sky with the practiced eye of someone whose life had depended on such readings many times. Storm coming? Eleanor asked, joining him at the door. Not for a day or two, Mason replied, but it's building. Will it delay our departure? Mason considered. Depends on how it develops. We'll know more tomorrow. Eleanor nodded, accepting his judgment. Oliver is worried about your sheep. What will happen to them while we're gone? They'll manage. The lean-to gives them shelter, and I'll leave enough hay. They're hardy creatures. Like their owner, Eleanor observed. Mason glanced at her, caught something in her expression that made his heart beat faster. He looked away quickly. We should check your ankle, he said, changing the subject. Make sure it's strong enough for the journey. Inside, Mason knelt to examine Eleanor's injured ankle. The swelling had gone down considerably, and she winced only slightly when he rotated the joint. "Healing well," he pronounced, "but you'll need to wrap it tightly for the journey. The snow will be deep in places." "I've known worse pain," Eleanor said. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder as she stood, the touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. That night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Mason and Eleanor sat by the fire, going over the final details of their plan. "Harrison will have men watching the main trail to County Town," Mason said, tracing the route on a rough map he'd drawn. "We'll take the high pass instead. It's longer but less traveled. Few know about it." "Is it dangerous?" Eleanor asked. "In winter? Yes, but I know it well." Mason hesitated, then added, "Clara and I used it when we first came to this valley." Eleanor's eyes softened at the mention of his wife. "Tell me about her," she said gently. Mason was silent for so long that Eleanor began to apologize. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "No," Mason interrupted. "It's all right." He took a deep breath. "Clara was a school teacher, smarter than me by half, strong-willed, kind. She loved books and music and believed everyone deserved education, regardless of circumstance." "She sounds remarkable," Eleanor said. "She was." Mason stared into the fire. "After the war, I was lost, angry. She saved me from myself, convinced me to use my marshal's pay to buy this land. We had plans." His voice roughened. "So many plans." Eleanor waited, giving him space to continue or stop. "When she got pregnant, it was like the sun came out after years of rain," Mason said finally. "We were so careful. Everything was ready. The cradle, the supplies. But then the winter came early. There was trouble at the mining camp. A dispute turned violent. I was the marshal. I had to go." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. "The storm caught you away from home." Mason nodded, the guilt he'd carried for 3 years heavy in his voice. "She went into labor early. I wasn't here. By the time I fought my way back through the blizzard," he couldn't finish. "Oh, Mason," Eleanor said softly, "it wasn't your fault." "Wasn't it?" The bitterness he'd tamped down for years surfaced. "I chose duty to strangers over my own wife, my own child. If I'd been here—" "You can't know that," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "I've seen childbirths go wrong even with doctors present. Some things are beyond our control." "I should have been with her," Mason insisted. "Instead, she died alone. Afraid." "No," Eleanor moved from her chair to kneel beside him, taking his rough hands in hers. "Clara knew you would come. She knew you were fighting to reach her. She wasn't alone because she carried your love with her." Mason looked into Eleanor's eyes, wanting desperately to believe her. No one had spoken to him of Clara this way, with understanding rather than pity, with insight rather than platitudes. "How can you know?" he asked hoarsely. "Because I know you," Eleanor replied simply. "Even in the short time we've been here, I've seen the kind of man you are. Clara would have known it far better, having been loved by you." Something broke in Mason then. A dam he'd built carefully for 3 years, stone by painful stone. He didn't weep, he was too far beyond tears. But he shuddered once, like a tree in high wind. Eleanor held his hands, anchoring him through the moment. When he finally looked up, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Tenderness mixed with something deeper, more complex. "Thank you," he said roughly. Eleanor smiled, the firelight catching the silver in her dark hair. "That's what friends are for, Mason Caldwell." Friends. The word both warmed and troubled him. It had been so long since he'd had a friend, so long since he'd allowed anyone close enough to see the wounds he carried. Later, as Eleanor slept and Mason kept watch by the window, he found himself wondering what Clara would think of his current situation, helping a strong-willed woman and her grandson escape a dangerous man, planning a treacherous mountain crossing in winter, feeling things he'd thought were buried with his wife and daughter. Clara would have liked Eleanor, he decided. They were similar in many ways, intelligent, principled, unafraid of hardship. And Oliver. Clara would have adored the boy's curious mind and gentle heart. She had wanted children, a house full of them, she'd said. Outside, the moon cast blue shadows across the snow. Mason watched a fox trot across the clearing, its dark shape stark against the white. Life continued. The world moved forward, regardless of human grief or joy. Perhaps it was time he did the same. Morning brought fresh challenges. Mason woke to the sound of Oliver coughing, a deep, worrying sound. The boy's face was flushed, his eyes too bright. "He's running a fever," Eleanor said, her hand on her grandson's forehead. It came on suddenly in the night. Mason frowned. Illness could derail their carefully laid plans. "Does he get sick often?" "Not since he was very young," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with concern. "But the cold, the stress—" "I'm fine," Oliver insisted between coughs. "I can still go tomorrow." "We'll see," Mason said, exchanging a glance with Eleanor. They both knew a sick child couldn't make the demanding journey they'd planned. Eleanor brewed willow bark tea, adding honey from Mason's dwindling supplies to make it more palatable. Oliver drank it without complaint, though Mason knew from experience how bitter it tasted. "Rest today," Mason told the boy. "Save your strength." Oliver nodded, clearly disappointed but too sensible to argue. He settled on his bedroll near the fire, wrapped in blankets, his wooden horse carving beside him. "I have herbs in my bag," Eleanor said quietly to Mason, "for the cough, but we need more honey and pine resin if you can find it." Mason nodded and prepared to go out. Before he left, he checked his rifle and tucked a pistol into his belt. Harrison's men might still be in the area. "Be careful," Eleanor said, her eyes conveying what her words didn't, that she understood the danger and feared for him. "Always am," Mason replied, trying for a lightness he didn't feel. Outside, the day was bright but cold. Mason headed for the pine grove where he knew he could find resin. As he walked, he remained alert, scanning the tree line, listening for any sound that didn't belong to the forest. He collected the resin efficiently, scraping it into a small tin. Then he checked his trap lines, finding a rabbit. Fresh meat would help Oliver regain his strength. As he reset the trap, Mason noticed something that made him freeze. Tracks, human tracks, and recent. Someone had been watching his cabin. Mason crouched low, studying the signs. One man, moving carefully, had circled the clearing where Mason's cabin stood. The tracks led away toward the east, toward Thornwood. A scout, reporting back. Cursing under his breath, Mason hurried back to the cabin. Their timeline had just shortened dramatically. Harrison would know they were there. He would return, and soon, with enough men to overcome any resistance. When Mason entered the cabin, Eleanor took one look at his face and understood. "They know," she said, not a question. "They know, Deputy," Mason confirmed, setting down his findings. "Fresh tracks. Someone watched the cabin, then headed east. How long do we have? If they ride hard, they could be back by nightfall." Eleanor's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we leave now." Mason shook his head, glancing at Oliver, who had fallen into a restless sleep. "The boy can't travel, not in his condition." "We have no choice," Eleanor insisted. "If we wait, we're trapped." Mason ran a hand through his hair, weighing impossible options. Stay and fight against unknown numbers with a sick child and a woman to protect. Flee immediately, risking Oliver's health in brutal winter conditions. Or, "There's a third option," he said slowly. Eleanor waited, tension visible in the set of her shoulders. "I take Oliver into the high country. There's a hunting cabin about 5 miles up. It's well hidden. You head for County Town with the documents. Once you've reached the authorities, we'll follow." "Separate?" Eleanor's voice sharpened with alarm. "No, absolutely not." "It makes tactical sense," Mason argued. "You're the one they want to stop. Oliver is safer away from you right now, and I can protect him." "I won't leave him," Eleanor said fiercely. "He's all I have left." "And if Harrison catches all of us," Mason countered, "what happens to Oliver then?" Eleanor fell silent, the terrible choice playing across her face. Mason knew he was asking the impossible of her. To leave her grandson, to trust Mason completely with the child's life, to face Harrison and his men alone. "You know I'm right," he said gently. "This gives both of you the best chance." "How would I find you afterward?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. "I'll mark the trail," Mason said. "Yellow cloth strips, only you would know to look for them." Eleanor looked at her sleeping grandson, then back to Mason. The struggle was visible in every line of her body. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "You won't," Mason promised. "On my life." Their eyes held for a long moment. Then slowly Eleanor nodded. All right, she said, her voice strengthening with decision. But we do this properly. They moved quickly after that, reorganizing their supplies. Eleanor would take the documents, enough food for 4 days, Mason's pistol, and the most direct route to county town. Mason and Oliver would take the rifle, most of the medical supplies, and extra blankets, heading for the hidden hunting cabin. As they worked, Oliver woke, his cough still troubling, but his fever slightly reduced thanks to Eleanor's remedies. When they explained the plan, the boy's eyes widened with fear. No, he protested, looking from his grandmother to Mason. We stay together. Please. Eleanor sat beside him, taking his small hands in hers. Oliver, listen to me. This is the safest way. Mr. Caldwell will protect you while I complete our mission. It's only for a few days. But what if Uncle Harrison catches you? The fear in the boy's voice tore at Mason's heart. He won't, Eleanor said with firm conviction. I'm taking a different route, one he won't expect, and I'm quite capable of defending myself. She touched the pistol Mason had given her. Oliver looked unconvinced. Promise you'll come back. I promise, Eleanor embraced him fiercely. Nothing in this world could keep me from returning to you. The boy clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder. Mason turned away, giving them privacy for their goodbyes. He busied himself checking the rifle one more time, securing the packs, making sure nothing essential was forgotten. When he turned back, Eleanor was standing, composed again, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. Oliver stood beside her, still unhappy but resigned. We should go soon, Mason said. While the daylight's strong. Eleanor nodded, then reached into her coat pocket. She withdrew a small object and pressed it into Oliver's hand. Keep this with you, she said, for luck and love. Mason glimpsed what appeared to be a gold pocket watch before Oliver clutched it tightly. It was your grandfather's, Eleanor explained. He carried it through the war between the states and back home again. It kept him safe then. It will keep you safe now. Oliver nodded solemnly, tucking the watch into his own pocket. The gesture seemed to give him strength. He straightened his shoulders slightly, looking older than his 9 years. I'll be all right, grandmother, he said with quiet dignity. Mr. Caldwell and I will wait for you at the cabin. I'll help keep watch. Eleanor smiled, pride mingling with the concern in her eyes. I know you will. She looked to Mason. Take care of him. With my life, Mason repeated, and meant it. The moment of departure came too soon. Mason had packed everything they could carry, leaving the cabin secured but with enough supplies for Eleanor to use when she returned. Oliver, bundled in extra layers against the cold, stood ready despite his pallor. Eleanor, dressed for hard travel, the precious documents secured inside her clothing, waited by the door. Yellow cloth, Mason reminded her, handing her several strips torn from an old shirt. Mark your trail coming back so you can find us. Eleanor nodded, tucking the cloth away. Then impulsively, she stepped forward and embraced Mason. Her arms were strong around him, her face briefly pressed against his shoulder. Mason, startled, hesitated only a moment before returning the embrace. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Before Mason could respond, she released him and knelt to embrace Oliver one last time. Be brave, she told him. I'll see you very soon. And then she was gone, moving with surprising speed across the snow, heading northwest toward the ridge that would lead her to county town. Mason and Oliver watched until she disappeared among the trees. She'll be all right, Mason said, as much to himself as to the boy. Your grandmother is a formidable woman. Oliver nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the spot where Eleanor had vanished. I know, he said quietly, but I still worry. Mason placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. That's what family does, he said gently. They worry about each other. Oliver looked up at him, something shifting in his expression. Are you family now, Mr. Caldwell? The question caught Mason unprepared. I'm a friend, he said finally. Someone who cares what happens to you and your grandmother. The boy seemed to consider this, then nodded, accepting the answer for now. We should go, he said, practical despite his age, before Uncle Harrison comes back. You're right. Mason shouldered his pack. It's a tough climb, but I'll help you. Tell me immediately if you need to rest. They set off in the opposite direction from Eleanor, heading east into the foothills. Oliver moved slower than Mason would have liked, but with remarkable determination for a sick child. His cough persisted, but he didn't complain, not even when the path grew steep. After an hour of steady climbing, Mason called a halt. Oliver's breathing had become labored, his face flushed with exertion and fever. "Rest," Mason said, helping the boy sit on a fallen log. "Drink some water." Oliver obeyed, sipping from the canteen Mason offered. "Is it much further?" he asked, trying to mask his fatigue. "About 3 more miles," Mason admitted, "but we'll take it slow." The boy nodded, his eyes drifting to the valley below. From their elevation, Mason's cabin was just visible, a small, dark shape against the snow. Beyond it, the land stretched away, beautiful and merciless. "I've never been this high up before," Oliver said, his gaze traveling across the vast landscape. "It's different up here," Mason agreed, "quieter, cleaner somehow." "Is that why you like being alone?" The question was innocent, without judgment. Mason considered it seriously. "Partly," he said. "After Clara died, being around people, it hurt. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost. Up here, I could just exist without expectations." Oliver nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "After my parents died, I didn't want to talk to anyone. Grandmother understood. She let me be quiet until I was ready." "She's wise that way," Mason said. "Were you ever going to be ready?" Oliver asked, his perceptiveness catching Mason off guard again. "To not be alone anymore?" Mason looked at the boy, struck by the depth of the question. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I wasn't looking for it, and then you and your grandmother tumbled into my life." Oliver smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Mason had seen from him all day. "Grandmother says the best things in life are rarely planned." "Your grandmother," Mason said with a small smile of his own, "is usually right." They continued their journey after the rest, Mason adjusting their pace to accommodate Oliver's condition. The boy was tougher than he looked, pushing through obvious discomfort without complaint. When he stumbled on a steep section, Mason simply lifted him and carried him for half a mile, the child's slight weight barely registering against Mason's strength. By mid-afternoon, they reached the hunting cabin, a crude but solid structure built years earlier by Mason and a few other settlers. It was smaller than Mason's own cabin, with just enough room for a fireplace, a rough table, and sleeping platforms built into the walls. "It's not much," Mason said as they entered, "but it's well hidden and warm once the fire gets going." Oliver looked around with interest, despite his exhaustion. "Did you build this too?" "Help build it," Mason corrected, setting their packs down. "Several of us worked on it. We used to hunt together sometimes before—" He trailed off. "Before your wife died," Oliver finished quietly. Mason nodded, busying himself with starting a fire. The cabin was cold but dry, protected from the worst of the elements by overhanging rock. Once the fire was burning steadily, he turned his attention to making Oliver comfortable. "You should rest," he said, arranging blankets on one of the sleeping platforms. "The medicine your grandmother prepared will help with the fever." Oliver didn't argue, allowing Mason to help him onto the platform. The boy was burning up again, the exertion of their journey having worsened his condition. Mason mixed the herbal remedy Eleanor had prepared and helped Oliver drink it. "Will grandmother really be able to find us here?" Oliver asked, his voice small and tired. "Yes," Mason assured him. "I'll make sure of it." The boy seemed satisfied with this answer, his eyelids growing heavy as the medicine took effect. "Mr. Caldwell?" he murmured, already half asleep. "Yes?" "I'm glad you found us in the snow." Mason felt something twist in his chest. "So am I, Oliver, so am I." As the boy drifted into sleep, Mason moved to the cabin's single window. From here, he had a clear view of the approach trail. Anyone coming would be visible long before they reached the cabin. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. Now came the waiting, the hardest part. Mason thought of Eleanor, making her way alone through the wilderness toward County Town. She was capable, yes, but the territory was dangerous even without Harrison's men potentially hunting her. Had he done the right thing, suggesting they separate, or had he made a terrible mistake? Outside, the late afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. A raven called from a nearby pine, its harsh cry echoing across the stillness. Mason settled in to keep watch, his thoughts divided between the sleeping child behind him and the determined woman making her way through the mountains ahead. For the first time in 3 years, Mason Caldwell had people to protect, people who mattered to him. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Whatever came next, he was no longer merely existing. He was living again. Ban Kali Fan Tu Con Tiu Hoang Was 602 So Bo Yu Ko. Tôi sẽ tiếp tục phát triển phần 2 từ điểm dừng trước đó, đảm bảo đủ 600-500 từ, giữ nguyên các twist và bám sát dàn ý đã duyệt. Dưới đây là phần tiếp theo của phần 2. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. Mason maintained the fire, keeping the small cabin warm enough for Oliver's comfort. The boy slept fitfully, his cough occasionally breaking the stillness. Every few hours, Mason would gently wake him to drink more of Eleanor's herbal remedy and some broth he'd prepared from their supplies. During one such moment, Oliver's eyes opened fully, clarity replacing the fever haze. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice stronger than before, "do you think Uncle Harrison will catch Grandmother?" Mason considered his answer carefully. False reassurances would disrespect the boy's intelligence, but brutal honesty might cause unnecessary fear. "Your grandmother is smart and knows these mountains better than Harrison does," he said finally, "and she has a good head start." Oliver nodded, seeming to appreciate the unvarnished truth. "Uncle Harrison has many men who work for him. Bad men, some of them." "Has he always been at Thornwood?" Mason asked, using the moment to learn more about their adversary. "Since I can remember," Oliver replied, sitting up slightly to sip the broth Mason offered. "But Grandfather never trusted him. Grandmother says he was always jealous because Grandfather left the ranch to Father instead of him." "And after your father died?" A shadow crossed Oliver's face. "Uncle Harrison started coming around more, being nice to Grandmother at first, then not so nice." Mason's jaw tightened. "Not so nice how?" Oliver hesitated. "He would shout when he thought I couldn't hear. Say things about Grandmother being too old, too weak to run Thornwood properly. He tried to make people in town think she was confused, forgetting things. But she wasn't." "No," Oliver said firmly. "Grandmother remembers everything. She writes it all down in her journals. That's why Uncle Harrison wanted her paper so badly. She has proof of the bad things he's done." Mason filed this information away, building a clearer picture of Harrison Montgomery. A man consumed by entitlement and greed, willing to manipulate, intimidate, and possibly kill to get what he believed should be his. "You should try to sleep more," Mason said, taking the empty cup. "The medicine seems to be helping." Oliver settled back onto the blankets but kept his eyes on Mason. "Will you tell me about when you were a marshal? Grandmother says you were very brave." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Does she now?" The boy nodded. "She said you must have been a good one because you notice everything and always tell the truth." Mason felt unexpected warmth at Eleanor's assessment. "It wasn't always exciting work," he said, stoking the fire. "Mostly keeping the peace between miners with too much whiskey in them." "But you helped people," Oliver persisted, "protected them." "I tried to," Mason acknowledged, though sometimes he trailed off, thinking of Clara, of his failure to protect the one person who mattered most. "Sometimes you couldn't save everyone," Oliver finished softly. "That's what Grandmother says about Grandfather and my parents. That she couldn't save them, but she could make sure their deaths weren't for nothing." Mason looked at the boy with new respect. "Your grandmother is a remarkable woman." "She likes you too," Oliver said with the direct honesty of childhood. "I can tell." Mason cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. "Rest now. Tomorrow might be a long day." Oliver complied, his eyelids growing heavy once more. "Mr. Caldwell?" he murmured as sleep reclaimed him. "Yes?" "I think my grandfather and father would have liked you." Mason sat motionless long after Oliver had fallen asleep, the boy's words echoing in his mind. There was something about children, their ability to cut through the complications adults created, to see and speak simple truths that grown men and women danced around. Outside, the moon rose, casting silver light across the snow. Mason moved to the window again, scanning the approach. No movement, no sign of pursuit. Yet. He thought about Eleanor, wondering where she was now. Had she found shelter for the night? Was she safe? The concern he felt surprised him with its intensity. In 3 short weeks, she had somehow become important to him in ways he hadn't allowed anyone to be since Clara. It wasn't just gratitude for her kindness or admiration for her strength. It was something more fundamental, a recognition, perhaps, a sense that she understood parts of him that had been dormant for years. Mason shook his head, trying to clear such thoughts. This wasn't the time. Survival came first. Everything else could wait. He checked his rifle again, then settled in for a long night's vigil. Dawn broke clear and cold. Mason had dozed intermittently through the night, always waking at the slightest sound. Oliver's fever had broken sometime in the small hours, his sleep growing more peaceful. When the boy finally woke, his eyes were clearer, his cough less frequent. "Feeling better?" Mason asked, placing a hand on Oliver's forehead. "Still warm, but not burning as it had been." Oliver nodded. "My chest doesn't hurt as much." "Good. Your grandmother's medicine did its work." Mason handed him a cup of hot tea sweetened with the last of the honey. "Drink this. We need to keep your strength up." As Oliver sipped the tea, Mason prepared a simple breakfast from their supplies. His mind was already working through the day ahead. They needed to remain hidden, but also alert for Eleanor's return, or for any sign of Harrison's men. "Will grandmother come today?" Oliver asked, watching Mason's face carefully. "Not likely," Mason replied honestly. "County town is at least 2 days hard travel from here. Even if everything went perfectly, she wouldn't start back until tomorrow at the earliest." Oliver absorbed this with a slight frown. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then we stick to the plan," Mason said firmly. "We wait here until it's safe, then I get you to county town myself." "But grandmother is smart, strong, and knows how to take care of herself," Mason interrupted gently. "We have to trust her, Oliver." The boy nodded, though worry still shadowed his eyes. "What will we do today?" "Rest, recover your strength, and I'll teach you a few things about surviving in these mountains." Mason smiled slightly. "Consider it continuing your education." After breakfast, with Oliver's condition improved enough for light activity, Mason began showing him how to identify animal tracks in the snow around the cabin. The boy proved an eager and quick student, soon distinguishing between rabbit, fox, and deer prints with remarkable accuracy. "You've got a good eye," Mason commented, as Oliver correctly identified a set of weasel tracks. "Father used to say the same thing," Oliver replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "He taught me to notice things. Said it was important to really see the world, not just look at it." "He was right," Mason agreed. "Observation keeps you alive out here." As they circled back toward the cabin, Oliver suddenly stopped, pointing to a set of tracks Mason hadn't noticed. Large, distinctive paw prints leading toward the valley. "Wolf," the boy said quietly. Mason knelt to examine the tracks. Fresh, made within the last hour. The same wolf he'd been tracking when he found Eleanor and Oliver in the storm? Possibly. "Good catch," he told Oliver, impressed. "You'd make a fine tracker." The boy beamed at the praise, standing a little straighter despite his lingering illness. Back at the cabin, Mason prepared more of the medicinal tea while Oliver worked on his wooden horse carving. The boy's hands moved with surprising dexterity, coaxing form from the simple piece of pine. "Where did you learn to carve like that?" Mason asked. "Grandfather started teaching me," Oliver replied, his focus on his work. "Before he died. Then one of the ranch hands, Mr. Turner, showed me more. He can carve anything, horses, cattle, even people's faces." "You've got a gift for it." Oliver looked up, pleased. "Really?" "Really," Mason confirmed. "Takes most men years to develop that kind of skill." A comfortable silence fell between them as they each worked. Oliver on his carving, Mason repairing a tear in one of their blankets. There was an ease to the moment that caught Mason by surprise. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this, peaceful in another person's company. The moment was shattered by a sound that made both of them freeze. The distant crack of a rifle shot, echoing across the valley. Mason was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Stay down," he told Oliver, his voice low and urgent. The boy obeyed, pressing himself against the wall beside the sleeping platform. "Is it Uncle Harrison?" he whispered. "Don't know yet." Mason peered carefully through the small window, scanning the slopes below. The shot had come from the southeast, the direction of his cabin. Someone was down there, and they weren't hunting game. No hunter would waste ammunition firing randomly. Minutes passed, no more shots came. Finally, Mason spotted movement. 3 riders moving through the trees near his cabin. Even from this distance, he recognized Harrison's distinctive gray horse. "They found the cabin," Mason said grimly. "They know we were there." "But they don't know where we are now, right?" Oliver asked, his voice small but steady. No, Mason assured him. They don't. And we chose this spot well. Unless they know exactly where to look, they won't find us. Even as he spoke the words, Mason watched Harrison's men begin to spread out, clearly preparing to search the surrounding area. They would check the obvious trails first, but eventually they might think to look higher up. We need to be ready to move if necessary, Mason told Oliver, turning from the window. Pack only what's essential. They worked quickly, gathering only what they couldn't survive without. Mason watched Oliver closely, concerned the activity might trigger another bout of coughing that could give away their position. But the boy remained remarkably composed, his movements deliberate and quiet. What about grandmother? Oliver asked as they finished packing. She won't know where to find us if we leave. Mason hadn't forgotten that problem. We'll leave markers, he said, signs only she would recognize. Through the small window, Mason kept track of Harrison's search patterns. They were working methodically, checking each trail that led away from the cabin. But they seemed to be focusing on the lower elevations, the most logical escape routes. They think we're running, not hiding, Mason observed. That gives us an advantage. As the afternoon wore on, Harrison's men continued their search, but none ventured up toward the hunting cabin. By dusk, they had regrouped near Mason's cabin. From his vantage point, Mason could see them preparing to make camp for the night. They're staying, he told Oliver, who had been patiently waiting for news, setting up around my cabin. Why not keep searching? The boy asked. Too dangerous in the dark, Mason explained. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. Oliver considered this. What will they do tomorrow? Expand their search, but they're looking for 3 people traveling together. They don't know we've split up. Mason turned from the window, which means your grandmother has a good chance of reaching County Town undetected. This thought seemed to comfort Oliver. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, the wooden horse in his hands. The carving was nearly complete now, a small, perfect rendering of a running stallion. I miss her, he said simply. Mason sat beside him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. I know, but she's doing this for you, to make sure you are safe. And for justice, Oliver added, his young voice suddenly fierce, for father and mother, and grandfather. Mason nodded, struck again by the maturity behind Oliver's words. Yes, for justice too. They ate a cold supper, not risking a fire that might be spotted from below. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Mason wrapped Oliver in both their blankets, insisting the boy take the warmth. But what about you? Oliver protested. I've weathered colder nights, Mason assured him. Get some sleep. Tomorrow might be challenging. Oliver hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold pocket watch his grandmother had given him. You should have this tonight, he said, holding it out to Mason. For luck and protection. Mason was touched by the gesture. That's your family heirloom, Oliver. You keep it. Grandfather would want you to have it tonight, the boy insisted. You're protecting his grandson. Recognizing the importance of the moment to Oliver, Mason accepted the watch with appropriate solemnity. I'll return it in the morning, he promised. Oliver nodded, satisfied, and settled under the blankets. Despite the tension of their situation, he fell asleep quickly, exhaustion and lingering illness overcoming anxiety. Mason kept vigil by the window, the gold watch heavy in his palm. It was an expensive piece, well-crafted and obviously cherished, the kind of heirloom that carried not just monetary value, but the weight of family history. Opening it carefully, Mason discovered an inscription inside the case. To George, may your heart always find its way home. With love, Eleanor. The simple sentiment struck Mason deeply. A reminder that Eleanor Montgomery was not just a formidable ranch owner or a determined grandmother, but a woman who had loved deeply and built a life with someone she cherished. Mason closed the watch and tucked it safely into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Below, in the valley, the campfires of Harrison's men glowed like malevolent eyes in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new decisions. But tonight, in this small cabin perched above the world, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. Purpose. And with it came a quiet determination that surprised him with its intensity. Harrison Montgomery might have money, men, and murderous intent, but Mason Caldwell had something stronger, people worth fighting for. The night deepened. Wind whispered through the pines surrounding the cabin. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, lonely, haunting, persistent. The same wolf Mason had been tracking when fate intervened? Perhaps. The sound faded, then rose again, closer this time. Mason thought of Eleanor, out there somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness, making her way toward help. He found himself offering a silent prayer for her safety, the first prayer he'd uttered since burying Clara and their daughter. "Find your way, Eleanor," he whispered to the darkness. "Find your way back to us, to Oliver, to Thornwood. To me," a voice inside him added, unexpected but undeniable. Mason touched the pocket watch again, feeling its steady rhythm against his fingers, like a heartbeat, like a promise. The long night continued, and Mason Caldwell kept watch, guarding more than just a sick boy in a hidden cabin. He guarded the possibility of a future he had never imagined, one that had arrived unexpectedly in a blizzard and changed everything. The third day dawned with an eerie stillness. Mason, who had dozed intermittently through the night, woke fully alert at the first hint of light. Something had changed. He moved quietly to the window, careful not to disturb Oliver's sleep. The valley below lay wrapped in morning mist, the world rendered in shades of blue and gray. Harrison's camp was stirring, men moving about the perimeter of Mason's cabin like ants around disturbed earth. But their movements held a new purpose, a direction that made Mason's stomach tighten. They had found a trail. From his vantage point, Mason could see Harrison himself gesturing toward the eastern ridge, not directly at their location, but close enough to concern. Someone had spotted sign of their passage, despite Mason's care to conceal their tracks. "Oliver," Mason said softly, turning from the window. "Time to wake up, son." The boy stirred, blinking away sleep. His face was less flushed this morning, his breathing easier. The worst of the illness had passed, but he was still far from his full strength. "Are they coming?" Oliver asked immediately, his mind jumping to the danger without hesitation. "Not yet, but they've found something." Mason handed him a piece of jerky in the canteen. "Eat quickly. We need to be ready to move." As Oliver ate, Mason checked their packs one final time, ensuring nothing essential would be left behind. The rifle was loaded, extra ammunition secured in his pocket. The boy's wooden horse carving, nearly complete now, was carefully wrapped and stowed in Oliver's small pack. "What about grandmother?" Oliver asked, voicing the concern that had surely been his first thought. "If we leave, how will she find us?" Mason had been considering this problem all night. "We'll leave signs for her," he said, "but only ones she would recognize." From his pocket, Mason withdrew several yellow cloth strips, torn from the same shirt he'd given Eleanor for trail markers. "We'll place these along our path, but hidden where only someone looking specifically for them would notice." Oliver nodded, relieved, like a secret code. "Exactly," Mason agreed, impressed by the boy's quick understanding. "Now, how are you feeling? Strong enough to travel?" Oliver straightened his shoulders. "I'm ready." Mason assessed him with a critical eye. The boy was putting on a brave face, but the illness had taken its toll. They would need to move slowly, conserve his strength. "We'll head higher into the mountains," Mason decided. "There's another cabin, smaller than this one, about 6 miles north. It's well hidden, used by trappers in the deep winter." "Will Uncle Harrison's men follow us that far?" Oliver asked. Mason's expression hardened. "They might try, but the terrain gets difficult, and a storm is building." He nodded toward the western horizon where dark clouds were gathering. "Weather's on our side this time." They set out within the hour, Mason carrying most of their supplies to spare Oliver's strength. The boy moved gamely beside him, his determination evident in every step. At strategic points along their path, Mason placed the yellow cloth markers under a distinctive rock, tied to a branch bent in an unnatural angle, wedged into a split tree trunk. Signs that would be meaningless to anyone but Eleanor. By mid-morning, they had climbed high enough to look back across the valley. Harrison's men had split into 3 groups, fanning out to search different areas. One group was definitely heading in their general direction, though not yet on their exact trail. "They're persistent," Mason muttered, watching the distant figures through a gap in the trees. "Uncle Harrison doesn't give up easily," Oliver said, his voice carrying a weight of experience beyond his years, especially when he wants something badly. The boy's insight into his uncle's character was telling. Mason wondered just how much Oliver had observed during his time at Thornwood, how much he understood of the adult conflicts swirling around him. Neither do we, Mason replied firmly. Come on, let's put some more distance between us and them. They continued north, the trail growing steeper, the forest thicker. Mason set a pace that challenged Oliver without exhausting him, watching carefully for signs of fatigue. The boy pushed on without complaint, though Mason noticed his breathing growing more labored on the steeper sections. Around noon, Mason called a halt near a small stream. While Oliver rested, Mason refilled their canteens with the ice-cold mountain water. "Do you think grandmother reached County Town yet?" Oliver asked, accepting the water Mason offered. Mason considered the question honestly. If all went well, she might have arrived last night or early this morning. And then she would tell the sheriff about Uncle Harrison? "That's the plan," Mason confirmed. "Once the authorities have the documents, Harrison's scheme falls apart." Oliver absorbed this, his young face solemn. But what if she didn't make it? The question hung in the air between them, giving voice to the fear neither had wanted to acknowledge. Mason crouched beside the boy, meeting his eyes directly. "Your grandmother is one of the most capable people I've ever met," he said steadily. "She knows these mountains, she's well prepared, and she has every reason to succeed. We have to trust her." Oliver nodded, drawing strength from Mason's confidence. "I do trust her. He stopped, his voice catching. "I know," Mason said gently. "I worry about her too." The simple admission seemed to comfort Oliver more than any false reassurance could have. They shared a moment of silent understanding before Mason rose to his feet. "We should keep moving," he said, helping Oliver up. "The storm will hit by nightfall." They continued their journey, climbing steadily higher. The forest thinned as they ascended, giving way to scattered stands of wind-twisted pines and open stretches of snow-covered rock. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of impending snow. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had overtaken the sky, and the first flakes began to fall. Mason scanned the terrain ahead, gauging distances and options. "There," he said, pointing to a rocky outcropping about half a mile away. "The trapper's cabin is just beyond those boulders." Oliver squinted through the thickening snowfall. "I don't see anything." "That's the point," Mason replied with a grim smile. "It's built to blend in." They pushed forward, the snow falling harder now, driven by an increasingly bitter wind. Oliver stumbled once, twice, his strength finally beginning to wane. Without comment, Mason lifted him onto his back and continued walking, the boy's slight weight barely slowing his powerful stride. "I can walk," Oliver protested weakly. "Save your strength," Mason replied. "We're almost there." The trapper's cabin appeared suddenly before them. Little more than a low stone structure built against the mountainside, its entrance nearly hidden by a natural formation of rock. If you didn't know exactly where to look, you would walk right past it. Mason set Oliver down and cleared the snow from the entrance. The door, little more than rough-hewn planks bound together, swung inward with a groan of protest. Inside, the space was cramped but dry, with a small fire pit in the center and crude sleeping platforms along one wall. "It's not much," Mason said as they entered, "but it will keep us alive." "It's perfect," Oliver replied with surprising enthusiasm, his natural curiosity momentarily overcoming his exhaustion. "Like a secret fortress." Mason smiled despite the gravity of their situation. The boy's resilience was remarkable. "Let's get a fire going before the real cold hits." While Oliver organized their meager supplies, Mason gathered the wood stacked along the cabin's back wall and built a small, efficient fire. The smoke escaped through a crude chimney cut into the rock, visible from outside only as a thin wisp quickly dispersed by the wind. The storm arrived in full force just as they settled in, howling around the cabin like a living thing. Mason secured the door with a wooden bar, then joined Oliver beside the fire. "Will this slow down Uncle Harrison's men?" the boy asked, holding his hands out to the warmth. "It will do more than slow them down," Mason replied. "No one travels in these mountains during a storm like this, not if they want to live." "But we're safe here?" "We're safe," Mason confirmed. "This cabin has weathered 100 Montana winters." They ate a simple meal from their supplies, conserving what they could for the days ahead. Oliver's cough had returned, aggravated by the cold and exertion, but his fever remained at bay. After eating, the boy curled up on one of the sleeping platforms, wrapped in both their blankets despite his protest that Mason should keep one. I'm used to the cold, Mason insisted. You need it more. As Oliver drifted towards sleep, Mason checked his rifle once more, then settled near the door where he could keep watch. Outside, the storm raged, snow and wind combining in a white fury that would erase all traces of their passage. A mixed blessing. It would hide their trail from Harrison's men, but it would also make it harder for Eleanor to follow the markers they'd left. Eleanor. Mason found his thoughts returning to her constantly now. Had she reached County Town? Was she safe? Or had Harrison somehow intercepted her? Mr. Caldwell? Oliver's voice came softly from the darkness. Yes? Do you think grandmother is somewhere warm tonight? The question echoed Mason's own concerns so perfectly that he had to take a moment before answering. I believe she is, he said finally. Your grandmother is too smart to be caught in this storm unprepared. She likes you, you know, Oliver said, his voice growing drowsy. I can tell. Mason felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Get some sleep, Oliver. Tomorrow will be a long day. The boy murmured something unintelligible, then his breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Mason remained by the door, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminish into a steady, heavy snowfall. The worst had passed over the Sem, but the snow would continue through the night, blanketing the mountains in fresh white. In the fire's dying glow, Mason found himself turning Eleanor's gold pocket watch over in his hands. The inscription inside seemed to speak directly to him. May your heart always find its way home. Home. Mason hadn't truly had one since Clara died. The cabin he'd built had been merely shelter, a place to exist rather than live. But these past weeks, something had shifted. With Eleanor's quiet strength and Oliver's resilient spirit, the cold spaces inside him had begun to thaw. It was dangerous to hope. Mason knew this better than most. Hope made you vulnerable. It created expectations that reality rarely fulfilled. And yet, like spring after the harshest winter, it persisted. Mason closed the watch and tucked it safely away. Outside, the night deepened, snow continuing to fall in the perfect silence that only a winter storm can create. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the sleeping boy and the man who had unexpectedly become his protector. Morning brought a transformed world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The sun broke through scattered clouds, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Mason stepped outside to assess their situation. The snow was deep, at least 2 feet of fresh powder on top of what had already been there. Good for hiding their location, but challenging for travel, especially with Oliver still recovering his strength. No sign of pursuit. Harrison's men, if they were still searching, would have been forced to seek shelter during the storm. It would take them time to regroup and pick up the trail again, if they could find it at all under the new snow. Mason scanned the horizon, looking for any movement, any hint of approaching figures. Nothing. They were alone on the mountain, isolated by snow and distance from both enemies and allies. Inside the cabin, Oliver was awake and already rekindling the fire with careful precision. The storm stopped, he said, looking up as Mason entered. It did. Left a lot of snow behind, though. Mason brushed the powder from his coat. How are you feeling this morning? Better, Oliver replied, and he did look improved. Less pale, his movements more energetic. My cough is almost gone. Good. We'll need your strength. Mason began preparing a simple breakfast from their dwindling supplies. The snow will make travel difficult, but it also hides us. How long will we stay here? Oliver asked. Mason considered carefully before answering. At least today, maybe tomorrow too. We need to give your grandmother time to reach us, and you need more rest before we attempt another journey. Oliver accepted this assessment without protest, though Mason could see the boy was anxious about his grandmother. They ate in companionable silence, the morning sun streaming through the cabin's single small window. After breakfast, Mason checked their supplies. They had enough food for perhaps 2 more days if they were careful. Water wasn't a concern with so much snow to melt. Firewood was plentiful, stacked neatly along the cabin's back wall by previous occupants. What do we do now? Oliver asked, having completed his own inventory of their small space. We wait, Mason replied, and we prepare for what comes next. To keep Oliver's mind occupied, Mason began teaching him more wilderness skills. how to start a fire using only natural materials, how to set snares for small game, how to read weather signs in the sky and clouds. The boy absorbed everything eagerly, his quick mind grasping concepts that had taken Mason years to master. My father wanted to teach me these things, Oliver said as they practiced making cordage from plant fibers. He said every man should know how to survive on his own. Your father was right, Mason agreed, though surviving with others is sometimes easier. Oliver glanced up at him. Is that why you were alone? Because it's easier? The question caught Mason off guard with its perception. No, he admitted after a moment, it wasn't easier, just safer for my heart. The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Grandmother was like that after my parents died. She still did everything she needed to do. Ran Thornwood, took care of me, but she was far away sometimes, inside herself. And now, boy? Mason asked, curious about Oliver's perception. Now she's back, Oliver said simply, especially since we met you. Mason busied himself with the cordage, unsure how to respond to such a statement. Oliver, perhaps sensing his discomfort, changed the subject. Do you think we'll have to fight Uncle Harrison? Mason looked at the boy seriously. I hope not. The law should handle him once your grandmother delivers the evidence. But if it comes to protecting you, yes, I'll fight. I'm not afraid, Oliver said, his chin lifting slightly. Well, not very afraid. It's all right to be afraid, Mason told him. Courage isn't about feeling no fear. It's about doing what is right despite being afraid. That's what grandmother always says, Oliver replied with a small smile. As I said before, your grandmother is usually right. They continued their lessons through the morning and into the afternoon. The sun moved across the sky, casting ever-changing shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Occasionally, Mason would step outside to scan their surroundings, but the mountain remained silent and empty. By late afternoon, clouds had begun gathering again to the west. Not the dark storm clouds of the previous day, but lighter formations that promised moderate snowfall. Mason studied them with a practiced eye. More snow coming tonight, he told Oliver when he returned inside. Not as heavy as last night, but enough to cover tracks. Is that good or bad for us? The boy asked. Both, Mason admitted. It hides us from Harrison's men, but it also makes it harder for your grandmother to find us. Oliver's face fell slightly at this reminder of their precarious situation. Do you think, he began, then stopped, as if afraid to voice his fear. Your grandmother is fine, Mason said firmly, guessing the boy's thoughts. She's smart, capable, and knows these mountains. Oliver nodded, wanting to believe. When will she come? If she reached County Town yesterday, and everything went well with the authorities, she could start back today. Depending on the weather and conditions, it might take her 2 days to reach us. Mason placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. We just need to be patient a little longer. As evening approached, they prepared a modest dinner from their supplies. Oliver's appetite had improved, a good sign that his health was returning. After they ate, the boy returned to his wooden horse carving, adding final details with painstaking care. It's for you, Oliver said when he noticed Mason watching, to say thank you for saving us. That's not necessary, Mason began. Grandmother says gratitude should always be expressed, Oliver replied solemnly, even when the other person says it isn't necessary. Mason smiled despite himself. Your grandmother has an answer for everything, doesn't she? Most things, Oliver agreed with a small grin, but she says the most important questions don't have easy answers. Wise woman, Mason murmured. The predicted snow began falling as night settled in, gentle flakes drifting past the small window. Mason secured the door and built up the fire for the night. Oliver, exhausted from the day's activities despite his improving health, fell asleep quickly on his sleeping platform. Mason took up his position near the door, rifle close at hand. The routine was familiar now, comfortable even. He found himself reflecting on how quickly humans could adapt to new circumstances, how a life that had been solitary for years could so suddenly be filled with responsibility for others. The quiet hours passed. Mason dozed intermittently, always waking at the slightest sound. Around midnight, something brought him fully alert. Not a noise, but a change in the quality of the silence outside. Moving carefully to avoid waking Oliver, Mason approached the window. The snowfall had stopped, and the clouds had cleared, revealing a nearly full moon that turned the landscape into a silver-white dreamscape. In that perfect illumination, Mason saw what had disturbed his instincts. A figure was moving across the snow about 100 yards from the cabin. A solitary figure, moving with purpose despite the deep snow. Mason's hand tightened on his rifle as he strained to see clearly. The moonlight caught the person's face as they paused to check their surroundings. Eleanor. Relief flooded through Mason so intensely it left him momentarily lightheaded. She had made it. She was alive, seemingly unharmed, and she had found their trail despite the snow. He moved quickly to the door, unbarring it and stepping outside. Eleanor spotted him immediately, her pace quickening as much as the deep snow allowed. When she reached him, her face was flushed with cold and exertion, but her eyes were bright with triumph. "You made it," Mason said, the simple words inadequate for the emotions behind them. "I promised I would," Eleanor replied, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "Oliver?" "Inside, sleeping. He's been sick but is recovering well." Relief washed over her features. "Thank God. And thank you, Mason." Without hesitation, she stepped forward and embraced him. Mason found himself returning the embrace, holding her tightly, as if to reassure himself that she was real, that she was safe. Her body was solid and warm against his, her silver-streaked hair carrying the scent of pine and snow. "Come inside," he said when they finally separated. "It's too cold to stand out here." In the cabin, Oliver remained asleep, his breathing deep and even. Eleanor moved to his side immediately, gently brushing the hair from his forehead with a tenderness that made Mason's chest tighten. "His fever?" she asked softly. "Broke yesterday. The cough is almost gone." Eleanor nodded, satisfaction and relief evident in her expression. She continued to watch Oliver sleep for a moment longer, then turned to Mason. "I reached county town," she said quietly, to avoid waking the boy. "Sheriff Parker was there, as I'd hoped. He took the documents and sent telegrams to Helena in Washington immediately." "And Harrison?" Mason asked. "Arrest warrants are being issued, for him and for several territorial officials involved in the land fraud scheme." A grim satisfaction showed in Eleanor's eyes. "They won't escape justice this time." Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "So it's over?" "Almost," Eleanor qualified. "We still need to get back safely. Harrison doesn't know yet that the authorities have the evidence, and he's desperate to find us." "His men were searching the valley yesterday," Mason confirmed. "They found our trail heading east, but the storm came before they could follow it all the way here." Eleanor removed her heavy coat, accepting the cup of hot coffee Mason offered. "I saw them on my way up, a group of 3 men camped below the ridge. They'll resume searching at first light." "Then we should be gone before they start," Mason decided. "Head straight for county town, where Sheriff Parker can protect you and Oliver until the arrests are made." "Agreed," Eleanor said, warming her hands on the coffee cup, "though the snow will make travel slow." They settled on a plan: leave at first light, taking a route that would avoid Harrison's men while leading them toward county town. Eleanor had marked her path with the yellow cloth as Mason had instructed, making it possible to follow her trail back down. With the immediate future decided, they fell silent. Eleanor's gaze moved around the small cabin, taking in the evidence of their days there. Oliver's few possessions carefully organized, the supplies Mason had rationed, the wooden horse carving nearly complete on the crude table. "He's been working on that for you," Mason said, following her gaze. Eleanor smiled softly. "He's always had a gift for creating beautiful things." She looked up at Mason, her expression growing serious. "Thank you for keeping him safe, for teaching him, for everything." "He's a remarkable boy," Mason replied honestly. "You've raised him well." "I've done my best," Eleanor said. "After his parents died, I promised myself I would give him the security and love he deserves. Harrison threatened that. I couldn't let him win." "He won't," Mason assured her. "Not now." Eleanor studied him, her perceptive gaze seeming to look beyond his words. "And what about you, Mason? What happens when this is over?" The question caught him unprepared. For days, his focus had been solely on survival, on protecting Oliver and reuniting him with Eleanor. He hadn't allowed himself to think beyond that immediate goal. "I don't know," he admitted. "Go back to my cabin, I suppose. Rebuild what Harrison's men have likely damaged." "Alone?" Eleanor asked quietly. The simple word hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Mason found he couldn't answer immediately. 3 weeks ago, alone had been his natural state, his chosen existence. Now the prospect felt hollow in ways he hadn't expected. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he said finally. Eleanor nodded, not pressing the point. "We should both rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be challenging." She moved to the empty sleeping platform, removing only her boots before lying down. Mason returned to his position near the door, rifle across his knees. But sleep eluded him now, his mind too full of questions he hadn't allowed himself to consider. What did he want when this was over? To return to his solitary existence? To rebuild the walls around his heart that Eleanor and Oliver had somehow breached? The thought no longer brought the comfort of familiar routine. Outside, the night was perfectly still, the new snow untouched beneath the moon's silvery light. Inside, Mason watched the steady rise and fall of Eleanor's breathing, the peaceful sleep of Oliver on his platform. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future than the one grief had prescribed for him. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Dawn arrived with a sky like polished steel, neither clear nor stormy, but heavy with the threat of change. They woke Oliver gently, his joy at seeing his grandmother tempered by the knowledge that danger still surrounded them. "We need to move quickly and quietly," Mason explained as they ate a hurried breakfast. "Harrison's men are still searching, and they're not far below us." Oliver nodded solemnly, helping pack their few belongings with efficient movements. Before they left, he presented Mason with the completed wooden horse. "It's yours now," the boy said formally, "to remember us by." Mason accepted the gift with equal seriousness, recognizing its importance to Oliver. "Thank you, it's fine work." Eleanor watched the exchange with a soft smile, her eyes meeting Mason's over the boy's head. Something passed between them in that look, acknowledgement perhaps, of bonds formed that weren't easily broken. They left as the first light strengthened, Mason leading the way through the deep snow. Eleanor followed with Oliver between them. The boy moved with renewed energy, his illness largely behind him. They maintained silence as they traveled, communicating with gestures and looks when necessary. The descent was slower than the ascent had been, the fresh snow making footing treacherous on the steeper sections. Mason kept them to the tree line where possible, using the forest for cover. At regular intervals, he would stop, listening for any sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. By mid-morning, they had made good progress, following Eleanor's path marked by the yellow cloth tied to branches and rocks. The day had warmed slightly, the steel-gray sky occasionally broken by patches of blue. Mason estimated they were about halfway to the valley floor, still well above where Harrison's men had been searching. They paused near a small frozen stream to rest and drink water. Mason moved ahead slightly, scouting the path ahead, when a sound reached him. Voices carried on the still air from below. He signaled Eleanor and Oliver to remain hidden, then crept forward to a vantage point where he could see down the slope. 3 men on horseback were making their way upward, following what must be traces of Eleanor's trail from the previous day. Harrison himself led them, his distinctive gray horse picking its way carefully through the snow. Mason returned quickly to Eleanor and Oliver, his expression grim. "Harrison and 2 men coming up," he said quietly. "They found your trail from yesterday." Eleanor's face tightened. "How close?" "Half a mile, maybe less. Moving slowly because of the snow, but they're determined." "What do we do?" Oliver whispered, his eyes wide but steady. Mason considered their options quickly. "We can't outrun them in this snow, especially not with Oliver still recovering. We can't go back up. There's nowhere to hide that they won't eventually find." "We have to stand and face them," Eleanor concluded, her hand moving to the pistol Mason had given her before they separated. "No," Mason said firmly. "Too risky." But an idea was forming, born of his years as a marshal when he'd had to outthink men with advantages of numbers or position. "What?" Eleanor prompted. "We separate again," Mason said. "I'll create a false trail leading west, obvious enough that they'll have to follow it. You and Oliver continue down toward County Town. By the time Harrison realizes he's been tricked, you'll be well ahead." Eleanor shook her head immediately. "I won't leave you to face them alone." "I won't be facing them," Mason explained, "just leading them away. Once I've drawn them far enough off your trail, I'll circle back and follow you to county town." "It's too dangerous," Eleanor insisted. "More dangerous for all of us to be caught together," Mason countered. "This way, at least you and Oliver will reach safety." Oliver watched this exchange with solemn attention, his young face troubled. "What if Uncle Harrison hurts Mr. Caldwell?" he asked his grandmother. Eleanor had no answer, her concern evident in her eyes as she looked at Mason. "I'll be fine," Mason assured them both. "I know these mountains better than Harrison ever could. This is our best chance." Eleanor struggled visibly with the decision, torn between the need to protect Oliver and her reluctance to leave Mason in danger. Finally, practicality won out. "All right," she conceded, "but you must promise to be careful and to follow us as soon as you can safely do so." "I promise," Mason said solemnly, meeting her gaze directly. They rearranged their supplies quickly, Mason taking only what he needed for a day's journey, leaving the rest with Eleanor and Oliver. Before they parted, Oliver impulsively threw his arms around Mason's waist in a tight hug. "Come back safe," the boy said, his voice muffled against Mason's coat. Mason returned the embrace, surprising himself with its intensity. "I will. Take care of your grandmother." And when Oliver stepped back, Eleanor moved forward. Without hesitation, she placed her hands on Mason's face and kissed him, briefly but with unmistakable meaning. "That's a promise," she said quietly. "Come back to us, Mason Caldwell." Mason, momentarily stunned, could only nod. "I will," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. They parted then, Eleanor and Oliver continuing down the path marked with yellow cloth, while Mason headed west, deliberately leaving a clear trail that Harrison couldn't miss. Broken branches, disturbed snow, even a dropped piece of cloth torn from his shirt. Once he was certain the false trail was established, Mason found a sheltered position where he could observe without being seen. Within 20 minutes, Harrison and his men appeared, following Eleanor's original trail. They paused exactly where Mason had predicted, finding the place where the paths diverged. Harrison dismounted, examining the diverging paths with the practiced eye of a rancher accustomed to tracking cattle across vast territories. Mason watched from his hidden position as Harrison knelt, running his gloved fingers over a broken branch. "This way," Harrison announced, pointing west along Mason's false trail. "They've tried to be clever." One of his men, a weather-beaten cowhand with a pockmarked face, looked skeptical. "You sure, Mr. Montgomery? The other trail leads straight down to the valley." "That's what they want us to think," Harrison snapped. "Look here, fresh breaks in these branches, disturbed snow. Too obvious. Caldwell is experienced in these mountains. He's trying to mislead us." Mason suppressed a grim smile. Harrison's arrogance worked in their favor. The man was too confident in his own tracking skills to consider he was being deceived. "Mount up," Harrison ordered. "We'll catch them before nightfall." As the three riders headed west following Mason's false trail, he waited patiently until they disappeared around the ridge. Only then did he move, quickly but carefully making his way down through the trees toward Eleanor and Oliver's path. His plan was working. Now he needed to rejoin them before Harrison realized his mistake. Mason traveled swiftly, his years in these mountains giving him intimate knowledge of hidden trails and shortcuts. After an hour of hard travel, he paused atop a small rise, scanning the path below. In the distance, he spotted two figures moving steadily downward, Eleanor and Oliver, making good progress toward county town. He was about to call out when the instinct made him hesitate. Something wasn't right. Scanning more carefully, Mason spotted a lone rider paralleling Eleanor and Oliver's path from a distance. A man Mason didn't recognize. Not one of the three who had followed his false trail. Harrison had been more cunning than Mason expected. He'd sent a fourth man, probably circling around from the east while the others approached from the west. This man was hanging back, observing, perhaps waiting for Eleanor and Oliver to lead him to their destination. Mason changed course immediately, moving through the trees to intercept the rider before he could get closer to Eleanor and Oliver. The snow made silent approach impossible, but Mason used the natural sounds of the forest, the creak of branches heavy with snow, the occasional fall of ice from the pines, to mask his movements. He positioned himself behind a large boulder, waiting as the rider approached. When the man was just a few yards away, Mason stepped out, rifle raised. "That's far enough," he said quietly. The rider reined in sharply, his hand moving toward his holstered pistol. "I wouldn't," Mason warned, his rifle steady. The man froze, then slowly raised both hands. He was younger than Mason had expected, perhaps no more than 25, with an uneasy expression that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his assignment. "What's your name?" Mason asked. "Jake Turner," the young man replied. "I work at Thornwood." "For Harrison Montgomery." Jake nodded reluctantly. "He pays the wages." "And what were your orders regarding Mrs. Montgomery and her grandson?" Jake hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Something in Mason's unwavering gaze must have convinced him that honesty was the safest course. "Follow them. Don't interfere unless they meet someone. Report back where they go." "Not to bring them back to Harrison?" Jake shook his head. "Mr. Montgomery said he'd handle that himself. Said I wasn't to get my hands dirty." Mason studied the young man, sensing something beyond mere obedience in his manner. "You don't seem entirely committed to your employer's cause." Jake's eyes dropped. "I've worked at Thornwood 5 years. Mrs. Montgomery's always been fair to me. Taught me carving when she found out I had an interest." His gaze drifted to the wooden horse hanging from Mason's pack, the one Oliver had carved. "Looks like the boy's got her talent." This unexpected connection clicked into place in Mason's mind. "You're the ranch hand who taught Oliver to carve." Surprise flickered across Jake's face. "He mentioned me?" "Said you could carve anything, horses, cattle, even people's faces." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a decision being made. "Mr. Montgomery isn't what he appears to be," he said quietly. "Things have changed at Thornwood since he started gaining influence. Good men let go for questioning orders. Strange visitors in the night. Documents disappearing from Mrs. Montgomery's study. And yet you follow his orders." "I've got a mother and sister in county town," Jake said simply. "Need the work." Mason lowered his rifle slightly, trusting his instinct about the young man. "What if there was a way to keep your job and help Mrs. Montgomery?" "How's that?" "The sheriff in county town is already expecting evidence against Harrison. Mrs. Montgomery delivered documents proving his corruption yesterday." Jake's eyebrows rose. "She made it to town?" "She did. Harrison's days at Thornwood are numbered. The question is, which side of this do you want to be standing on when it ends?" Mason could see the calculations happening behind Jake's eyes, weighing loyalty, safety, morality, and self-interest. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked finally. "Ride back to Harrison. Tell him you lost their trail in the new snow. By the time he realizes the truth, it will be too late." Jake considered this, then nodded slowly. "And after?" "That depends on you," Mason replied. "But Mrs. Montgomery will need loyal hands at Thornwood when this is over. Men she can trust." The young ranch hand straightened in his saddle. Decision made. "Tell her. Tell her I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner about what I saw." "Tell her yourself when this is done," Mason suggested. Jake nodded, then turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Mason watched until he disappeared among the trees, hoping his judgment of the young man's character wasn't mistaken. With no time to waste, Mason hurried down the mountain, following Eleanor and Oliver's tracks. The morning had warmed enough to soften the snow, making travel faster now. By early afternoon, he spotted them again, much closer this time, resting in a small clearing. "Eleanor! Oliver!" he called, keeping his voice low enough not to carry far. They turned quickly, Oliver's face lighting up with relief and joy. The boy ran toward him through the snow, nearly losing his balance in his enthusiasm. "Mr. Caldwell, you came back!" Mason caught him, surprising himself by lifting the boy into a brief, fierce embrace before setting him down. "I promised I would." Eleanor approached more slowly, her eyes searching his face. "Harrison?" "Following a false trail west," Mason explained. "But he had a fourth man tracking you from the east." He quickly told them about his encounter with Jake Turner. "Jake?" Oliver looked up, surprised. "He wouldn't hurt us." "I don't think he wanted to," Mason agreed. He seemed relieved to have an excuse to ride away. Eleanor's expression was thoughtful. "I've always believed Jake was a good young man at heart. His father worked for George before he passed. But can we trust him not to return to Harrison immediately?" "We can't afford to assume either way," Mason said. "We need to reach county town by nightfall." They continued their journey with renewed urgency, Mason leading them onto a lesser-known trail that would take them more directly to their destination. Oliver kept pace admirably, his strength returning with each passing hour. Eleanor moved with a determined grace that Mason had come to admire, never complaining despite the difficult terrain. By late afternoon, they emerged from the forest onto the main road leading into county town. The small settlement appeared in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys against the darkening sky. They had almost reached safety when the sound of approaching horses made them pause. "Quick, into the trees," Mason urged, guiding them off the road. They concealed themselves just as three riders came into view. But it wasn't Harrison. The lead rider wore a silver star on his coat, Sheriff Parker, accompanied by two deputies. "It's all right," Eleanor said, stepping back onto the road and waving. The sheriff reined in, relief evident on his weathered face. "Mrs. Montgomery, we were just heading out to look for you. Got worried when you didn't return yesterday." "We encountered some difficulties," Eleanor explained diplomatically. Sheriff Parker's gaze moved to Mason, assessing. "This would be the man who helped you, I take it?" "Mason Caldwell," Eleanor confirmed. "Without him, neither Oliver nor I would have survived." The sheriff nodded respectfully to Mason. "The county owes you a debt, Mr. Caldwell." "No debt," Mason replied, echoing what he'd said to Eleanor that first night. "Just did what's right." "Well, you'll be pleased to know your evidence has already set things in motion, Mrs. Montgomery," the sheriff continued. "Telegrams came back this morning. Federal marshals are on their way from Helena, should arrive by tomorrow's train." "And Harrison?" Eleanor asked. "No sign of him at Thornwood. His things are gone. Looks like he left in a hurry after you disappeared." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Won't get far, though. Every law officer in the territory will have his description by now." As they spoke, the sound of more horses approached from behind them, a single rider leading two riderless horses. Jake Turner. The sheriff's hand moved to his pistol, but Eleanor stepped forward. "It's all right, he's from Thornwood." Jake reined in, nodding respectfully to Eleanor. "Mrs. Montgomery, Mr. Caldwell told me I might find you on this road." His gaze shifted to Mason. "Harrison and the others figured out they were following a false trail. They're heading this way, maybe an hour behind me." Sheriff Parker's expression sharpened. "How many men?" "Just three, Harrison and two hands," Jake replied. "The others refused to ride with him once word spread about the federal investigation." The sheriff turned to his deputies. "Michaels, escort Mrs. Montgomery and the boy into town. Davis, you're with me," and he looked questioningly at Jake. "Turner, sir. Jake Turner. And Turner here. We'll intercept Montgomery before he reaches town." Eleanor turned to Mason, concern in her eyes. "You should go with Oliver. You've done enough." Mason shook his head. "Not quite finished yet." He looked to the sheriff. "I'm coming with you." Sheriff Parker studied him a moment, then nodded. "Extra gun might come in handy." Eleanor stepped close to Mason, her voice low. "Be careful. Harrison is desperate now. The most dangerous kind of man." "I will," Mason promised. He knelt briefly to Oliver's level. "Look after your grandmother. I'll see you both soon." Oliver nodded solemnly, then impulsively hugged Mason once more. "You promised," he whispered. "I keep my promises," Mason assured him. As Eleanor and Oliver rode toward town with Deputy Michaels, Mason mounted the spare horse Jake had brought and joined the sheriff, Davis, and Jake. They rode back up the road, positioning themselves at a bend where the forest provided cover on both sides, a natural place for an ambush. "We'll take them alive if possible," Sheriff Parker instructed. "Harrison Montgomery needs to face a judge for what he's done." They didn't have long to wait. Within the hour, three riders appeared in the distance, moving at a steady trot toward town. Harrison in the lead on his distinctive gray horse, followed by the two hands Mason had seen earlier. They were trail-worn and grim-faced, Harrison especially showing the strain of the failed pursuit. Sheriff Parker stepped his horse into the middle of the road, badge gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "Harrison Montgomery, you're wanted for questioning. Dismount and surrender your weapons." Harrison reined in sharply, his companions following suit. For a moment, Mason thought he might comply. Then Harrison's hand flashed toward his pistol. "Gun!" Mason shouted, already diving from his saddle as the first shot cracked across the clearing. The next moments were chaos. Sheriff Parker returned fire, catching one of Harrison's men in the shoulder. The wounded man fell from his horse, clutching his arm. The second hand threw down his weapon immediately, clearly wanting no part of a shootout with law officers. Harrison, however, had used the distraction to spur his horse off the road into the trees, heading east away from both the town and the mountains. "He's making for the river," Jake called. "There's a ford 2 miles downstream." Mason was already remounting. "I know these woods better than he does," he told the sheriff. "I can cut him off before he reaches it." Without waiting for permission, Mason urged his horse into the trees, taking a game trail that ran parallel to Harrison's likely route. The terrain was familiar to him. In his hunting expeditions, he'd explored every creek and ridge for miles around his cabin. He pushed the horse hard, leaping fallen logs and splashing through shallow streams. After 10 minutes of hard riding, he emerged at the river ford just as Harrison's gray horse appeared on the opposite bank, the rider leaning low over its neck as he urged it into the swift current. "Harrison!" Mason called, his voice cutting across the sound of rushing water. "It's over!" Harrison's head snapped up, his face contorting with rage when he recognized Mason. With a shout of frustration, he drew his pistol and fired wildly across the river. Mason ducked, the bullet splintering bark from a tree beside him. He raised his rifle, aiming not at Harrison, but at the water just in front of the gray horse. His shot struck with precision, sending up a splash that startled the animal. The horse reared, nearly unseating its rider, then lost its footing on the slippery riverbed. Horse and rider went down in the current. Harrison's cry cut short as he hit the icy water. The gray horse managed to regain its feet, struggling back toward the bank it had come from. But Harrison was swept downstream, clutching desperately at rocks and branches. Mason spurred his horse along the riverbank, keeping pace with the struggling man. Harrison was a strong swimmer, fighting the current with determination born of desperation. When he managed to catch hold of a fallen tree extending into the water, Mason dismounted and approached cautiously, rifle ready. "Give it up, Harrison," he called. "You've got nowhere to go." Harrison looked up, water streaming from his face, hatred burning in his eyes. "You," he spat, "a nobody, a hermit hiding in the mountains. Who are you to interfere in my affairs?" "Just a man," Mason replied, echoing words he'd said to Eleanor that first night, which now carried a different weight. "Doing what's right." Something dark and desperate crossed Harrison's face. With a sudden lunge, he released the tree and struck out for the opposite shore, away from Mason. But the current was too strong, the water too cold. Within moments, his strokes weakened, his head dipping beneath the surface once, twice. Mason hesitated only a second before setting down his rifle and plunging into the freezing river. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, but he forced himself forward with powerful strokes. He reached Harrison just as the man went under a third time, grabbing his coat collar and hauling him back to the surface. "Let go," Harrison gasped, struggling weakly. "I'd rather drown." "Not your choice," Mason grunted, fighting the current to drag them both towards shore. By the time Sheriff Parker and the others arrived, Mason had Harrison on the riverbank, both men soaked and shivering. The would-be land baron lay on his back, coughing up river water, all fight gone from him. Sheriff Parker dismounted, looking from Harrison to Mason with frank admiration. "You risked your life to save a man who would have killed you without hesitation." Mason, wringing water from his coat, shrugged. "Justice requires a living man." "Among other things," the sheriff agreed, securing Harrison's hands with iron cuffs. "It requires men like you, Caldwell." 3 days later, Mason stood on the porch of the County Town Hotel, watching as a group of federal marshals escorted Harrison Montgomery aboard the eastbound train. The evidence Eleanor had gathered, combined with testimony from Jake Turner and other Thornwood employees, had been damning. Harrison faced charges not only for the land fraud scheme, but for his role in the deaths of Eleanor's son and daughter-in-law. "They're taking him to Helena for trial," Eleanor said, joining Mason on the porch. "From there, likely to a federal prison." Mason nodded. "Justice at last." "Yes." Eleanor's gaze remained on the departing train for a moment before turning to Mason. "And now?" The question hung between them, laden with possibility. Inside the hotel, Oliver was resting, still recovering from his illness and the strain of their journey. Soon they would return to Thornwood to rebuild what Harrison had nearly destroyed. And Mason, "I've been thinking about that," he said slowly. "My cabin will need repairs after Harrison's men were through with it." "Yes, I imagine so," Eleanor agreed, waiting for the rest. Mason turned to face her fully. 3 years is a long time to live with ghosts, Eleanor. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Too long. I thought I was honoring Clara's memory by punishing myself, Mason continued. Living half a life. But these past weeks have shown me something different. He paused, finding the right words. Clara wouldn't have wanted that for me. She believed in living fully, in helping others, in love. Eleanor's breath caught slightly at the last word. And what do you believe in now, Mason Caldwell? Second chances, he said simply. If they're offered. Eleanor's hand found his, warm and steady. They are, for all of us. From inside the hotel came Oliver's voice, calling for his grandmother. Eleanor smiled, squeezing Mason's hand before releasing it. Come, she said. Oliver has been working on designs for improvements to your cabin. He seems to think it needs a proper bedroom for a growing boy to visit on weekends. Mason felt something expand in his chest, not the sharp pain of grief he'd carried for so long, but the warm certainty of coming home after a long journey. Smart boy, he said, following Eleanor inside. Takes after his grandmother. August heat shimmered over the meadow. Mason wiped sweat from his brow as he examined the new addition to his cabin. A second room with large windows facing the mountains, built with timber he'd cut himself and raised with the help of Thornwood ranch hands. Oliver darted past, chasing a butterfly with the boundless energy of youth. The boy spent every weekend at the cabin now, learning the ways of the mountains from Mason, returning to Thornwood during the week for proper schooling under Eleanor's watchful eye. It's perfect, Eleanor said, joining Mason in the shade of the pine tree. You've created something wonderful here. We have, Mason corrected gently, taking her hand. Their relationship had developed slowly over the summer months, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Mason had become foreman of Thornwood's northern range, not charity, but a partnership that benefited them all. Eleanor managed the ranch with her usual efficiency, her position as owner now unchallenged. The shadow of Harrison's schemes finally lifted. Oliver had flourished, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by the natural curiosity and joy of childhood. He carried his wooden carvings in a special pouch Mason had made for him, adding to his collection with each visit to the mountains. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the meadow, the three of them stood together on the porch of the expanded cabin. Oliver perched on Mason's shoulders to see farther, pointing excitedly at a distant herd of elk moving through the valley below. Will you teach me to track them tomorrow? The boy asked eagerly. If the weather holds, Mason promised. Some skills take patience to learn. Like carving, Oliver nodded seriously. And love. Eleanor and Mason exchanged surprised glances at the boy's perception. Yes, Eleanor agreed softly, especially love. Later, after Oliver was asleep in his new room, Mason and Eleanor sat on the porch, watching as stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The summer air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers and pine. Winter tests us, Eleanor said, echoing words she'd spoken months ago during that first snowbound week. Mason nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Spring proves what remains. She leaned her head against his shoulder, their hands intertwined. And summer? Mason smiled, feeling peace settle in his bones as he looked at the cabin. No longer a shrine to what he'd lost, but a home filled with new life, new hope, new love. Summer, he said, is for the living.